Margaret Henderson woke up every morning at exactly 6:30 a.m. Not because of an alarm clock, but because her body had trained itself over 8 long years of being the neighborhood watch. She lived in Meadowbrook Estates, a quiet little neighborhood, where every house looked almost the same and every lawn was supposed to be perfectly green. Margaret wasn't just any regular neighbor. She was the HOA president, which meant she was in charge of making sure everyone followed the rules. And boy, did she take that job seriously. Maybe too seriously, if you asked her neighbors. But Margaret didn't care what they thought. Someone had to keep this place looking perfect, and that someone was her. Her house sat right at the corner where Maple Street met Oak Street. From her big living room window, she could see almost every house in the neighborhood. It was like having the best seat in a movie theater, except the movie was watching her neighbors and making sure they didn't break any rules. Every single morning, Margaret would make her coffee, grab her special notebook, and sit by that window. She had a whole system worked out. First, she'd check if anyone put their trash cans in the wrong spot. Then she'd look at everyone's lawns to see if the grass was too long or too short. After that, she'd examine the mailboxes, the driveways, and even the flowers in people's front yards. Margaret had been doing this routine for so long that she knew everything about everyone. She knew that Mr. Peterson always forgot to bring his trash cans back inside until Wednesday evening. She knew that the family with the red car always parked it 2 inches over their driveway line. She even knew that old Mrs. Riley had been letting her rose bushes grow a tiny bit too tall for the past 3 weeks. On this particular Tuesday morning in late September, the weather was perfect. The sun was shining, there was a nice cool breeze, and the leaves were just starting to change colors. It should have been a peaceful morning. But Margaret was about to discover something that would turn her whole world upside down. She started her morning routine just like always. First stop, checking the Chen family's house. Sure enough, their trash can was sitting 2 whole inches past the property line. Margaret wrote this down in her notebook with a red pen. Red pen meant serious violation in her color coding system. Next, she moved her attention to the Johnson family's lawn. She pulled out her binoculars to get a better look. The grass looked longer than usual. Margaret had memorized the HOA rules, and grass couldn't be longer than 3 inches. The Johnsons' grass looked like it might be 3¼ inches. Another red pen entry in her notebook. Then she turned her binoculars toward the Martinez family's house. They had recently planted some new flowers in their front yard, and Margaret wanted to make sure they matched the neighborhood's approved color scheme. As she adjusted her binoculars to get a clearer view of their flower bed, something else caught her eye. Up in the sky, right above her own house, was a cloud. But this wasn't just any ordinary cloud. This cloud looked different. It was bigger than the other clouds around it, and it had a strange shape. Most clouds look soft and fluffy like cotton balls floating in the sky. But this cloud looked more solid, more defined. It had sharp edges and an odd color. Margaret lowered her binoculars and looked up with her naked eyes. The cloud was definitely there, and it was definitely strange. She raised the binoculars again and focused directly on it. The cloud appeared to be a grayish-green color, which was unusual. Most clouds are white or gray, but this one had a weird tint to it. But what really bothered Margaret was that the cloud wasn't moving. She had been looking at the sky for years during her morning routine, and she knew how clouds were supposed to behave. They were supposed to drift across the sky with the wind. They weren't supposed to just sit in one spot like a parked car. Margaret set down her binoculars and checked her watch. It was 8:15 a.m. She decided to keep an eye on this cloud and see what happened. Maybe it would start moving in a few minutes. But as she continued her neighborhood inspection, she kept glancing back up at the sky. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. 15 minutes. The cloud was still there, in exactly the same spot. This was definitely not normal. Margaret had lived in this neighborhood for 23 years, and she had never seen a cloud behave like this. She knew everything about weather patterns, wind directions, and how the sky looked during different seasons. This cloud was breaking all the rules of nature, just like some of her neighbors broke the HOA rules. By 8:45 a.m., Margaret had completely forgotten about checking on her neighbors. All her attention was focused on this mysterious cloud floating above her house. She went to her kitchen and grabbed her phone to take some pictures. She wanted to document this strange occurrence, just like she documented all the rule violations in her neighborhood. Margaret stepped out into her backyard to get a better angle for her photos. The cloud looked even more suspicious from outside. It seemed to be positioned perfectly over her house, like it was specifically targeting her property. In all her years of being the neighborhood watch, Margaret had developed a keen sense for when something was wrong. And right now, every instinct in her body was telling her that this cloud was very, very wrong. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. After taking her first few photos of the strange cloud, she decided this situation needed a proper investigation. She wasn't just going to stand there and let some mysterious, flying object hover over her property without getting to the bottom of it. She rushed back inside her house and grabbed her late husband's old toolbox from the garage. Robert had been gone for 3 years now, but he had left behind all sorts of useful equipment. Margaret pulled out his measuring tape, his old surveying tools, and even a compass he used to use for his weekend hiking trips. Back in her yard, Margaret started documenting everything like a real detective. She held up the measuring tape against her house and tried to estimate the size of the cloud. It looked to be about 40 feet across, maybe a little bigger. She wrote this down in her notebook, along with the time and the exact location in the sky. Then she used Robert's compass to figure out the exact direction the cloud was positioned. It was sitting perfectly northeast of her house, right above her bedroom window. Margaret found this detail very suspicious. Why would a cloud choose to hover directly over the most private part of her home? She took 17 different photos, from every possible angle. Photos from her front yard, her backyard, and even from her upstairs bedroom window. In each photo, the cloud looked exactly the same. It hadn't moved even a tiny bit. Margaret had never seen anything like this in her entire life. By 9:30 a.m., Margaret realized she needed backup. This was too big for her to handle alone. She picked up her phone and called her friend Dorothy Walsh, who lived just 2 houses down the street. Dorothy was also on the HOA board, though she wasn't nearly as dedicated as Margaret. The phone rang twice before Dorothy answered. "Hello, Margaret, how are you this morning?" "Dorothy, you need to get over here right now," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice calm but urgent. "Something very strange is happening above my house, and I need a witness." "What do you mean, something strange?" Dorothy asked. She was probably still in her pajamas, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper like she did every morning. "There's a cloud, Dorothy. But it's not acting like a normal cloud. It's been sitting over my house for over an hour now, and it hasn't moved 1 inch. I've been documenting everything, but I need someone else to see this." Dorothy paused for a moment. "Margaret, are you feeling all right? Maybe you should sit down and have some water." "Dorothy, I'm perfectly fine. Just please come over here. Bring your camera too. We need to document this properly." Within 10 minutes, Dorothy appeared at Margaret's front door. She was still wearing her slippers and had thrown on a light jacket over her house clothes. Margaret immediately dragged her to the backyard and pointed up at the sky. "There it is, Dorothy. Look at that cloud and tell me that's normal." Dorothy looked up and saw what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary cloud floating in the blue sky. It was a little bigger than some of the other clouds, but nothing seemed particularly unusual about it. "Margaret, honey, it just looks like a regular cloud to me," Dorothy said gently. "Regular clouds don't stay in one place for over an hour," Margaret replied firmly. "I've been watching it this whole time. It hasn't moved at all. Look, I'll show you." Margaret pulled out her phone and showed Dorothy the 17 photos she had taken. "See? In every single photo, the cloud is in exactly the same position. The timestamp proves it's been there for over an hour without moving." Dorothy looked through the photos and had to admit that the cloud did appear to be in the same spot in each one, but she also knew that clouds could sometimes move very slowly, especially on days when there wasn't much wind. "Maybe it's just a calm day," Dorothy suggested. "Sometimes when there's no breeze, clouds can stay in one area for a while." But Margaret wasn't buying it. She had lived in this neighborhood long enough to know the difference between slow-moving clouds and completely stationary ones. She pulled out Robert's old weather station equipment, which she had set up on her patio table. "Look at this, Dorothy. The wind speed is showing 4 miles per hour from the southwest. That's enough wind to move clouds. But look up there. That cloud isn't moving at all. Margaret pointed to the other clouds in the sky. See those clouds? Over there? They're all drifting along with the wind just like they're supposed to. But this one over my house is completely still. That's not natural, Dorothy. Dorothy had to admit that Margaret had a point. The other clouds were indeed moving, slowly across the sky, while the one above Margaret's house seemed to be staying put. But Dorothy was a practical woman who didn't jump to wild conclusions. Even if it's not moving, Margaret, it's still just a cloud. What exactly do you think is going on here? Margaret's eyes lit up with the excitement of someone who had figured out a mystery. I think someone is using that cloud to watch our neighborhood, Dorothy. I've been reading about these things on the internet. There are all kinds of new technologies that people use for surveillance these days. Surveillance? Margaret, who would want to spy on our neighborhood? That's exactly what we need to find out, Margaret said, pulling out her notebook again. I've been thinking about this and it makes perfect sense. Our neighborhood is one of the nicest in the whole city. We have expensive houses, well-maintained properties, and most people here have good jobs. We're the perfect target for criminals who want to study our routines. Dorothy looked skeptical, but Margaret was getting more excited by the minute. Think about it, Dorothy. From up there, someone could see when people leave for work, when they come home, when they go on vacation. They could figure out which houses have the best security systems, which ones have dogs, which ones have elderly people living alone. Margaret gestured wildly at the cloud above them. That cloud has been watching my house all morning. It probably saw me doing my neighborhood inspection. Now whoever is controlling it knows that I'm the one who keeps an eye on things around here. They're probably planning to do something when I'm not around. Dorothy was starting to get worried, but not about the cloud. She was getting worried about her friend Margaret. This kind of paranoid thinking wasn't like her at all. Margaret, I really think you're overthinking this. It's probably just unusual weather or something. But Margaret had already made up her mind. She spent the next 30 minutes showing Dorothy all her evidence and explaining her theory about the surveillance operation. By the time Dorothy left to go home, Margaret was completely convinced that her neighborhood was under attack from above. After Dorothy left, Margaret felt more alone than ever. Her best friend didn't believe her, but Margaret knew what she was seeing. The cloud was still there, hanging over her house like a giant gray umbrella. She checked her watch again. It was now 11:45 a.m. The cloud had been in the same spot for over 3 hours. Margaret went back inside and made herself a sandwich, but she couldn't eat. She kept looking out the window every few minutes to check on the cloud. Each time she looked, it was still there. Sometimes it seemed to shift slightly, but Margaret was sure this was just part of its surveillance pattern. She decided to create a proper timeline of events. Margaret got out a fresh piece of paper and started writing down everything that had happened since she first noticed the cloud. She wrote down the exact times, the weather conditions, and even what she had been doing when she first spotted it. As she was writing, Margaret noticed something that made her blood run cold. The cloud had moved slightly to the left. Not much, maybe just a few feet, but it had definitely changed position. To Margaret, this proved everything. Random clouds don't move in small, careful movements. This cloud was being controlled by someone. Margaret grabbed her binoculars and rushed back outside. She focused on the cloud and studied it carefully. Now that she was looking closer, she could see what looked like different shades of gray within the cloud. Some parts were darker than others, and there seemed to be patterns in the way the gray and white mixed together. This is definitely not natural, Margaret said to herself. She had watched thousands of clouds over the years, and none of them had ever looked like this one. Margaret started pacing around her backyard, thinking about what to do next. She could call Dorothy again, but Dorothy clearly didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. She could try calling other neighbors, but most of them thought she was too strict about the HOA rules anyway. They probably wouldn't take her seriously. Then Margaret remembered something she had seen on a crime show last week. When people noticed suspicious activity in their neighborhood, they were supposed to report it to the authorities. This wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. This was about public safety. Margaret marched back into her house and picked up her cordless phone. She stood by her kitchen window so she could keep watching the cloud while she made the call. Her hands were shaking slightly as she dialed 911. The phone rang once, then twice. On the third ring, a woman's voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? Margaret took a deep breath. She had rehearsed this moment in her head, but now that it was actually happening, she felt nervous. Yes, hello. My name is Margaret Henderson, and I live at 1247 Maple Street in Meadowbrook Estates. I need to report suspicious activity that's been happening above my house. Okay, ma'am. Can you tell me what kind of suspicious activity you're seeing? Margaret looked out the window at the cloud, which was still hovering in the same general area above her house. There's an object that's been positioned over my property for the past 3.5 hours. It's not moving like it should be, and I believe it's being used to watch my neighborhood. Ma'am, what kind of object are you referring to? It's a cloud, Margaret said firmly. But it's not acting like a normal cloud. Normal clouds move with the wind, but this one has been staying in the same spot for hours. I've documented everything with photographs and measurements. There was a pause. On the other end of the line, Margaret could hear the dispatcher typing something on a computer keyboard. Ma'am, did you say this is about a cloud? Yes, that's correct. A very suspicious cloud that's clearly being used for surveillance purposes. I'm the president of our homeowners association, and I take neighborhood security very seriously. This kind of aerial intrusion is completely unacceptable. Margaret could hear the dispatcher talking to someone else in the background, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. Ma'am, clouds are natural weather formations. They're made of water vapor, and they move based on wind patterns and atmospheric conditions. I understand what clouds are supposed to be, Margaret replied, getting frustrated. But this is not a normal cloud. I've lived in this neighborhood for 23 years, and I know what the sky is supposed to look like. This cloud is different. Margaret walked to her sliding glass door and stepped out onto her patio while still holding the phone. I'm looking at it right now. It's approximately 40 feet in diameter. It has an unusual grayish-green color, and it's been maintaining position over my house since 8:15 this morning. Ma'am, I understand your concern, but... No, you don't understand, Margaret interrupted. Someone is using this cloud to spy on our neighborhood. They're probably watching to see when people leave for work, when children walk to school, when elderly residents are home alone. This is a serious security threat. Margaret was getting more worked up as she talked. All her fears and suspicions were pouring out at once. I have a responsibility to protect the residents of Meadowbrook Estates. We pay good money to live in a safe, secure neighborhood, and I won't let some criminal organization use aerial surveillance to threaten our way of life. The dispatcher was trying to stay patient, but Margaret could hear the strain in her voice. Ma'am, I'm going to send an officer to your location to speak with you about this matter. Thank you, Margaret said, feeling relieved that someone was finally taking her seriously. Please tell them to hurry. The longer this cloud stays in position, the more information it's gathering about our neighborhood. An officer should be there within 20 minutes. Please stay on the line until they arrive. Actually, I need to hang up now, Margaret said. I want to take more photographs and measurements before the officer gets here. I need to have all my evidence ready. Margaret hung up the phone and immediately grabbed her camera. She had 20 minutes to gather as much proof as possible. She took pictures from every angle, wrote down more detailed observations in her notebook, and even sketched a diagram showing the cloud's exact position relative to her house and the surrounding buildings. As she worked, Margaret felt a sense of satisfaction. Finally, someone in authority was going to investigate this strange situation. Soon, everyone would see that she had been right all along. The cloud was definitely up to no good, and Margaret Henderson was going to be the hero who exposed the whole operation. She checked her watch one more time. The police should be arriving any minute now, and Margaret was ready for them. Margaret was standing by her front window when she saw the police car turn onto Maple Street. Her heart started beating faster with excitement. Finally, someone with real authority was coming to investigate this serious situation. She grabbed her folder full of evidence and rushed to the front door. The police car pulled into her driveway and Margaret watched as two officers got out. The first officer was a tall man with dark hair who looked to be in his 30s. The second officer was a woman with blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. They both walked up Margaret's front walkway with serious expressions on their faces. Margaret opened the door before they could even knock. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. I'm Margaret Henderson, the one who called about the surveillance situation." The male officer looked at his notepad. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm Officer Rodriguez, and this is my partner, Officer Kim. We received a call about suspicious activity at your residence." "Yes, exactly. The perpetrator is still in position above my house. Come with me and I'll show you everything." Margaret stepped out onto her front porch and pointed dramatically up at the sky. "There it is, officers, the cloud that's been conducting illegal surveillance on our neighborhood." Both officers looked up at the sky. They saw a regular gray cloud floating peacefully above the house. It looked completely normal to them. Officer Rodriguez looked back at Margaret, then up at the cloud again. "Ma'am, you called 911 about that cloud up there?" "Yes, I did. And I'm glad I called when I did. This cloud has been hovering over my property for nearly 4 hours now. I have extensive documentation proving that this is not normal weather behavior." Margaret opened her folder and pulled out her photographs. "Look at these pictures, officers. I took 17 different photos from multiple angles, and in every single one the cloud is in the exact same position. I also have timeline documentation showing its movements, or lack thereof." Officer Kim took the photos and looked through them politely. To her, they all showed the same ordinary cloud from different angles. "Mrs. Henderson, these appear to be photos of a regular cloud formation. Regular clouds don't stay in one place for 4 hours," Margaret said firmly. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 23 years and I know how weather patterns work. This cloud is being controlled by someone for surveillance purposes." Officer Rodriguez tried to explain basic weather science. "Ma'am, clouds are made of water droplets and ice crystals that form in the atmosphere. They move with wind currents and air pressure systems. What you're seeing up there is completely normal weather." But Margaret wasn't having any of it. "Officer, with all due respect, I think I know the difference between normal weather and suspicious aerial activity. I've been the HOA president here for 8 years, and part of my job is monitoring everything that happens in this neighborhood." She pulled out more papers from her folder. "I've documented the wind speed, the cloud's dimensions, and its exact position relative to my house. I even have witness statements from my neighbor Dorothy, though she wasn't as observant as she should have been." Officer Kim exchanged a glance with her partner. They had been briefed about this call during their drive over, but seeing Margaret in person made the situation even more unusual than they had expected. "Mrs. Henderson, can you help us understand why you think this cloud is being used for surveillance?" Officer Kim asked gently. Margaret's eyes lit up. Finally, someone was asking the right questions. "It's obvious when you think about it logically. Our neighborhood is one of the most desirable areas in the city. We have expensive homes, well-maintained properties, and residents with good incomes. We're the perfect target for criminals who want to study our daily routines." She gestured toward the houses around them. "From that position in the sky, someone could observe when people leave for work, when children go to school, when elderly residents are home alone. They could identify which houses have the best security systems, which ones have dogs, and which families go on vacation." Officer Rodriguez tried to interrupt, but Margaret was on a roll. "Think about it, officers. I'm the neighborhood watch president. I'm the one person in this entire area who pays attention to suspicious activity. If someone wanted to conduct surveillance on Meadowbrook Estates, they would need to neutralize me first. That's why this cloud is positioned directly over my house." By now, some of Margaret's neighbors had started to notice the police cars in her driveway. Mrs. Peterson came out to get her mail and lingered by her mailbox, clearly curious about what was happening. The family with the red car had their teenage son washing the car in their driveway, but he kept glancing over at Margaret's house. Margaret noticed the gathering attention and saw it as an opportunity to rally support. "Officers, as you can see, This situation is causing concern throughout the entire neighborhood. People are scared, and they have every right to be. She walked toward the middle of her front yard and raised her voice slightly. Everyone, please don't panic. The authorities are here to investigate the aerial surveillance operation that's been targeting our community. Young Tommy Martinez, who was riding his bicycle on the sidewalk, stopped and looked up at the sky. Mrs. Henderson, that's just a regular cloud. We learned about clouds in science class last week. Margaret turned to face the 10-year-old with a serious expression. Tommy, this is exactly why we need proper neighborhood security. Children like you don't understand how dangerous this situation could be. That cloud has been watching all of us for hours. Officer Rodriguez realized that this situation was getting out of hand. More neighbors were starting to come outside, and Margaret was beginning to create a scene in the middle of the street. Mrs. Henderson, I need you to understand something important. Calling 911 is reserved for actual emergencies. When you call about non-emergency situations, you're taking resources away from people who might be in real danger. Margaret's face started to turn red. This is a real emergency, officer. That cloud is violating our homeowners association regulations. According to our neighborhood covenant, no unauthorized aerial objects are permitted above our properties without proper permits and advance notification. She pulled out a copy of the HOA rulebook from her folder. Right here in Section 12, subsection 4, it clearly states that any activity affecting the airspace above residential properties must be approved by the HOA board. That cloud up there is in direct violation of our community standards. Officer Kim tried to reason with her. Mrs. Henderson, HOA regulations don't apply to natural weather formations. Clouds are part of the natural environment, and they're not subject to neighborhood rules. How do you know it's natural? Margaret demanded. Have you tested it? Have you investigated who's controlling it? Have you verified that it's actually made of water vapor like you claim? The two officers looked at each other again. They were dealing with someone who had created an elaborate theory in her mind and wasn't going to be easily convinced otherwise. Ma'am, I can assure you that what you're seeing is a normal cloud, Officer Rodriguez said patiently. There's no surveillance equipment, no criminal operation, and no violation of any laws. But Margaret was getting more agitated by the minute. Officers, I demand that you investigate this properly. I want that cloud tested. I want whoever is controlling it arrested, and I want a full report filed about this security breach in our neighborhood. By now, Margaret's front yard had turned into quite the spectacle. More neighbors had come outside to see what all the commotion was about. Mrs. Peterson stood by her mailbox pretending to sort through her mail, while obviously listening to every word. The teenage boy washing his car had completely stopped what he was doing and was openly staring. Even old Mr. Wilson had come out onto his porch with his morning coffee to watch the drama unfold. Margaret saw all these people gathering and felt vindicated. Finally, the whole neighborhood would see that she had been right all along. She turned to address the growing crowd of onlookers. Everyone, please remain calm, Margaret announced in her most authoritative HOA president voice. The police are here to investigate the serious security breach that's been happening above our neighborhood. I've been monitoring this situation all morning, and I can assure you that the authorities are taking it very seriously. Little Tommy Martinez, who was still standing with his bicycle, pointed up at the sky again. Mrs. Henderson, my teacher, said clouds are made of tiny water drops that float in the air. That's just a regular cloud up there. Margaret looked down at the 10-year-old with the patience of someone explaining something very important to a child who didn't understand. Tommy, sweetheart, this is exactly why adults need to handle serious situations like this. That cloud has been watching our entire neighborhood for over 4 hours. It knows when your parents leave for work, when you ride your bike to school, and when your family eats dinner. Tommy's mother, who had been watering her flowers, overheard this conversation and walked over. Margaret, you're scaring my son. It's just a cloud in the sky. There's nothing dangerous about it. Mrs. Martinez, I understand you want to protect your child, but ignoring this situation won't make it go away, Margaret replied firmly. As the HOA president, I have a responsibility to keep everyone in this neighborhood safe. That includes your family. Officer Rodriguez could see that Margaret was becoming more agitated and was starting to alarm the neighbors. He needed to take control of this situation before it got completely out of hand. Mrs. Henderson, I need you to listen to me very carefully, he said in his most serious police officer voice. What you're seeing in the sky is a completely normal weather formation. There is no surveillance operation, no criminal activity, and no threat to your neighborhood. But Margaret wasn't backing down. Officer, how can you be so sure without conducting a proper investigation? Have you run tests on that cloud? Have you checked for electronic equipment? Have you contacted air traffic control to see who authorized this aerial intrusion? Officer Kim stepped forward and tried a different approach. Ma'am, I understand that you're concerned about neighborhood security. That shows you care about your community, and that's admirable. But sometimes our minds can play tricks on us and make us see patterns or threats that aren't really there. Margaret's face turned bright red. Are you suggesting that I'm imagining things? I have photographs, measurements, timeline documentation, and witness statements. This is not in my imagination, officer. This is real, and it's happening right now above my house. She pointed dramatically at the cloud, which was still floating peacefully in the sky. Look at it, it's still there. How much more proof do you need? The crowd of neighbors was getting larger, and Margaret interpreted this as support for her cause. See, officers, the entire neighborhood is concerned about this situation. We all pay taxes. We all deserve to feel safe in our own homes, and we all have the right to protection from illegal surveillance. Old Mr. Wilson spoke up from his porch. Margaret, I've been watching that cloud for the past 10 minutes, and it's definitely moved. It's not sitting in the same spot anymore. Margaret whirled around to face him. Mr. Wilson, that's exactly my point. The cloud is adjusting its position to get better surveillance coverage of our street. It's probably repositioning itself to watch the Martinez family's house now. Officer Rodriguez had heard enough. He had been patient with Margaret. He had tried to explain the situation reasonably, and he had given her every opportunity to understand that this was not an emergency. But Margaret was clearly not going to accept any explanation that didn't involve some kind of conspiracy or surveillance operation. Mrs. Henderson, I need you to understand something very important. Making false reports to 911 is a serious offense. When you call emergency services for situations that aren't actually emergencies, you're taking valuable resources away from people who might be in real danger. Margaret looked shocked. False report? Officer, this is absolutely not a false report. I've documented everything properly. I have evidence, I have witnesses, and I have legitimate concerns about neighborhood security. Ma'am, calling 911 because you think a cloud is conducting surveillance is not an appropriate use of emergency services, Officer Kim explained. Emergency services are for situations where people are in immediate danger, where crimes are being committed, or where urgent medical attention is needed. This is urgent, Margaret insisted. Every minute that cloud stays up there, it's gathering more information about our neighborhood. The longer we wait to take action, the more dangerous this becomes for everyone who lives here. Margaret turned back to her neighbors, hoping they would support her. Everyone, please tell these officers that you're concerned about this situation. 2. Tell them that you want this investigated properly. But instead of support, Margaret saw confusion and concern on her neighbors' faces. They weren't worried about the cloud. They were worried about her. Mrs. Martinez gently took her son's hand and started walking back toward their house. Mrs. Peterson had stopped pretending to sort her mail and was openly staring at Margaret with a worried expression. Even the teenager washing his car looked uncomfortable and had started packing up his supplies to go inside. Officer Rodriguez made a decision. Mrs. Henderson, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us to the station. Making false emergency reports is against the law, and we need to discuss this situation further. Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. You're not arresting me. You should be arresting whoever is controlling that cloud. I'm the victim here, not the criminal. Ma'am, you're not being arrested for being a victim. You're being detained for misusing emergency services, Officer Kim explained as she pulled out her handcuffs. This is exactly what they want, Margaret shouted as the officer gently guided her hands behind her back. They're silencing me because I discovered their operation. This proves that the surveillance cloud is part of a bigger conspiracy. As Margaret was being led to the police car, she called out to her neighbors. Don't let them fool you. That cloud is still up there watching all of us. Someone needs to keep monitoring the situation while I'm gone." The neighbors watched in stunned silence as Margaret was placed in the back of the police car. Most of them had known her for years. She had always been strict about the HOA rules, and sometimes she was a little too involved in everyone's business, but they had never seen her act like this before. As the police car pulled out of Margaret's driveway, everyone looked up at the sky one more time. The cloud was still there, drifting slowly across the blue sky just like clouds are supposed to do. It had no idea that it had just caused the biggest drama Meadowbrook Estates had seen in years. Margaret spent that night in jail, convinced that her arrest was all part of the conspiracy. The cloud, completely unaware of the chaos it had caused, continued its natural journey across the sky. By the next morning, it had drifted away to hover over some other neighborhood, where hopefully no one would call 911 about it. Margaret was later fined $500 for making a false emergency report and was required to attend a community education class about the proper use of emergency services. But she never stopped believing that she had uncovered a major surveillance operation that day. The cloud was never charged with any crime.